Good morning. Well, good afternoon, where I'm at, and it's actually cold here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's where we broadcast from here. Professor Smith and the Afrolantican Legal Academy presenting a series of videos explicating my new book, Afrolantican Jurisprudence, basically Afrocentric legal history and its commitment to equal protection of the law. Let me apologize. This is episode 6. We're talking about Queen Hatshepsut and equal protection of gender in the Nile Valley. And I'm going to apologize from the beginning. This is going to be a long one. I always think that I'm going to finish these and I just give you something that you can easily digest in 15, half hour, maybe 45 minutes. And they tend to go on at least for about an hour or so. So I make no promises here. And yeah, I'm pretty sure we're going to go over an hour because there's just so many things to talk about when it comes to not just Queen Hatshepsut. She's our central figure. But we're talking about matrilineality, matriarchy in the Nile Valley and how it dispersed through the rest of Africa. How do we know that it's part of the culture of Africa? How is it part of African political and cultural unity? And so we're going to go through a lot of different things as far as matrilineality and matriarchy and the female queens of not just Egypt, but also Nubia. We'll mention Queen Kahina and Zinga and Angola. But we're going to focus on Queen Hatshepsut because in my opinion she would be the greatest queen and perhaps even greatest monarch of all time, and I'm not exaggerating. That's not hyperbole. I wish we could get into all of her story, even the controversy, because some of her accomplishments have been attributed to others, and there's pretty much there's a controversy of how much of the 18th dynasty under Tutmos 1, 2, 3, and even to 4 belonged to them versus Queen Hatshepsut. That said, again, let's dive into it. Our last episode, we talked about the tale of the eloquent peasant. The tale of the eloquent peasant. That was Kunanup and his travails going to Upper Egypt and getting ensnared in a trap by the wealthy, and him suing to get his goods back, and basically exhorting the principles of Mott and excoriating the government officials that were accused of being impartial and leading Egypt astray and being part of what we call an intermediate period where Egypt is not great, where Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt are not joined together, where, and we'll talk about that first intermediate period in this discussion here. So I'm going to try to move quickly. I can't dwell on any one subject or I'm going to keep you here that much longer. Okay, so let me make sure to be precise about the claim. We're saying that African cultural unity beginning with the Nile Valley. We'll talk about priority between Nubia, Egypt, the concept of Ethiopia, and how far it extended. And we're going to argue that they had an extraordinary commitment to equal protection of law. That's going through all these episodes. And here we're going to talk about, we talked about class when it came to the tale of the eloquent peasant and how due process and equal protection of law are linked together when it comes to protecting the poor. When it comes to gender, it's a little bit different. Yes, due process helps, being impartial helps, but what are the laws themselves structured in a way that subordinates gender or promotes equality of gender? And here we're not going to pretend that it was perfect. We're not going to pretend that it was utopia. We'll talk about how even if it's conceptually in veneration or venerating women, many of the male action figures are still male. And we also want to make sure we note that when we talk about Egypt, we're talking about a 3,000-year history. So not only is it not the same in all periods, we make the point that it is the commitment to equal protection of gender, the commitment to matrilineality and matriarchy is strongest in the Old Kingdom when it's clear that the African interior is the source of culture in the state of Kemet. And we also see, again, Nubia taking over those reigns, and we might even call that Ethiopia, again, the ancient writers used to confuse the two. We're not going to go that right now, but we're going to have to address it at some point. So, okay, so our argument is, more precisely, is that Kemet and African states thereafter, when it comes to gender, is just more meritocratic than others. Okay, so let's talk about matrilineality. We talked about that in the third episode. We talked about matrilineality, the origins of law, how when we talk about Pharaonic society or the Nile Valley societies, particularly Upper Egypt, which is in the south, Thebes, the Theban dynasties, those that are ruling out of Thebes, being in control of most of the great periods, and how that mythology or their religions often or almost always respected women and had women gods or female gods on par with the male gods. And an interesting thing also, again, is that they were typically monogamous, right? Where Zeus was out doing his thing every which way, we see pairings and couples here. And it's represented not just by Ma'at. One thing we didn't speak about on Ma'at was Ankh. Ankh, the symbol of Ankh, right? So even there we have the male represented by the triangular shape at the bottom, the phallus, and the woman representing the circle of life on top. So even in the Ankh, this idea of balance, right? And you'll note the self and others, or for the children on the arms, and they all meet at a point, and it has to balance, right? Everything has to balance. Okay, so even in the cosmogony, in the philosophy, again, when we talk about the Egyptian gods, right, there's Mut, there's Nut, there's Isis, Nephthys, Neith, Sekhmet, Hathor. I mean, they're replete with women gods, and typically speaking, it seems as though the female gods often represent the ideal conception of the thing, whereas the male represents the action figure. So again, Ma'at being truth, justice, order, balance, being female, right? Thoth is her male counterpart, who acts as judge, right, and weighs the soul of the dead against Ma'at's feather, right? You have Ma'at's feather as the ideal, you have human conduct, the soul or the Ka, on the other end of the scale, and Thoth being the judge, the action figure that determines whether or not the will of Ma'at has been fulfilled, right? And that male figure in Egyptian history, again, is the pharaoh, right? And he identifies himself with Horus, who is the son of Osiris and Isis, or Asar and Aset. Nevertheless, there were several female pharaohs. There were at least 5 female pharaohs, and there were also other women, queen mothers, royal sisters, who often seemed to act as head of state or co-regent or regent in themselves, even if not by official name. But as far as official name, there were at least 5 women pharaohs that were named, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. But going back to this idea about religion and matrilineality, and it's so integral. It's not just about mythology. It's very integral to the political system and the state, especially in African society, because legitimacy, this idea of representing Ma'at, of representing Osiris, Isis, and Horus, and also Hathor, being called or identifying later with Amun, right? Amun becomes a unifying god for the African interior. Later in when we talk about the Middle Kingdom and also the New Kingdom, they're all unified under instead of all of these several gods all of a sudden come under Amun, right? And you've heard of Baal Amun or Jupiter Amun or Amun Re or Amun Ra. So Amun becomes this unifying figure, and to identify in the person or the woman who is identified as one of the daughters of Amun, means that I can tax you, right? This earth belongs to the gods and the Mother Earth and is protected by the king. However, this claim to legitimacy requires a marriage and a partnership with a woman that's going to be known as our Queen Mother, also royal sisters, and then also some rule outright. Without that legitimacy, again, our then we're paying taxes strictly by force instead of voluntarily so. So matrilineality. Before we talk about matriarchy, again, I mentioned matrilineality, that African society was matrilineal. What do I mean by that? Let's talk specifically. Patrilineality, the right of primogeniture, the right of the oldest son to be the king after the old king dies. That is a concept that we are seemingly very familiar with our movies, books, and mythology, but it is a very, very Eurocentric view. African societies, the son of the father did not have some automatic right to the throne, to property. As a matter of fact, if we'll talk more about Black Panther and Wakanda, great movie. However, Killmonger, as the son of the king, would not have a right to the throne, or even to contest for the throne. And we'll talk about elections later. It wouldn't be a physical contest. There are elections in Africa, in pre-colonial African societies. But he is not the son of Yuri, the Queen Mother, right? In a matrilineal society, only the children of the Queen Mother are eligible to be elected by the Council of State to be the king after the old one passes or is ineffective. This is why you'll often see brothers, and it's very confused for those that are absolutely used to a patriarchal or a patrilineal system. When they see brothers take the throne in African societies, and perhaps some others outside of Africa, there's almost always the assumption that there was a coup, that one brother killed the other brother, when in fact, in African societies, no, when king dies, the Queen Mother, her male children, whether of any particular generation, are eligible for election. So it could very well be a younger or even older brother of the former king who is the person selected to be the new king or pharaoh. Okay, so this idea of god kings that anoint themselves and rule as autocratic figures is not the truth most of the time. There are instances where that happens, and we'll see that to me is a lack of equal protection. That's a lack of commitment to the rule of law and due process. And we see that Egypt and other African states fall. They rise up in wealth, but they fall very quickly when they adopt these autocratic systems. So again, matrilineal systems, that Queen Mother position is very, very, very important. And of course, the Queen Mother is going to pass at some time. And so again, who becomes the next Queen Mother is something that's absolutely not discussed in historical texts often enough, hardly at all. We'll talk about the 18th dynasty after Hatshepsut. These women that are described as the great royal wives. And it's unclear. Are they the great royal wives? Have they just been appointed or selected by the king, which seems inconsistent with matrilineality, in that instead we should be focusing on the Queen Mother's daughters. And we'll rehash that issue a little bit later, because it's very interesting when it comes to the 18th dynasty, because there's a lot of women of very high repute, and the extent of their authority and extent of their power is heavily debated. Okay, so what do we mean what do I mean by equal protection of law? We talked about due process in the tale of the eloquent peasant. We've talked about due process and the idea that there's courts and laws, and that's basically the idea that we can't, in the American Constitution, says we can't deprive you of your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But that also means that we can take your life, your liberty, and your property so long as we give you a process of law that we, the court system, or the government officials, believe is due or is quote unquote fair. The basic tenets of due process are notice, right? Notice of either the thing that I've been charged with, or in a public right setting, notice of the things that are available to me from the government, right? So it could be benefits or penalties, but notice thereof. I need to know what you're charging me with. I need to know what's available to me. I need to know what the processes are as far as getting it, right, or avoiding it. So the second part is that on top of notice, we expect a right to be heard. Right, so due process is broken up into two parts: impartiality. Notice and a right to be heard. This right to be heard, these things that allow us to be heard, is we call it process, right? Do you have a court? Do you have a lawyer? Does it record it? Do you get to confront your witnesses? All of the things that make a hearing so-called fair. And these things are individual rights. Now, it relates to due process in the respect that, okay, part of due process is an impartial judge, but that's only part of due process. There's lots of things that are process that have nothing to do with equal protection. But the impartiality of the decision maker does have a very profound effect on whether everybody in society is treated equally, right? And we are arguing that African cultural practices, African political practices, the ideal practice unto them, under Mott and then extended throughout Africa from top to bottom, east to west, north to south, is committed to equal protection greater than other parts of the world. And we talk about equal protection, we're talking about instead of this individual right or to be treated fairly, the idea that my group, the groups to which I associate with, will be treated fairly. And so one of the first questions we ask when it comes to jurisprudence of equal protection is, well, what groups are we talking about? All the people that just eat spaghetti on Wednesdays, is that a group that should be protected? In America, we have a cabinet to so-called insular minorities, right? So gender, even though women are majority, right? Gender is protected class, and the levels of protection vary. So we're not race. We're not allowed to discriminate overtly on race. But then the question becomes, well, what non-overt practices are allowable that disadvantage one race versus another, or women versus others, or people of one religion versus another, or foreigners versus homegrown or citizens, and that's in class. Is class a subject where equal protection should be involved, where the government should be restricted from having rules and regulations that disadvantage those who are already poor? In America, class is not recognized as a protected category. Go see U.S. v. Rodriguez in 1971. It is basically one of the first cases to pull back on Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education says can't discriminate on race. Okay, well, that's fine. So they decided, well, black people are poor, and so we'll just so long as we have so-called self-segregation, we'll commit your property taxes to your schools in those areas. And the argument was that was a violation of equal protection as to class. And again, this didn't just deal with black folks. Hispanics or even just poor white folks lost in that case, where the state said no. Education, one of the premier vehicles for meritocracy, can be hoarded by the state for those with means. And so it's interesting to see whether that commitment to the poor is whether it's consistent or inconsistent with prior practices. Now, again, we're dealing with gender today, and I don't want to go too far afield because we're already 20 minutes in, and I haven't even talked about Queen Hatshepsut specifically yet. I'll try to move it along. At the same time, I'm also trying to relax and slow down so that we don't just brush over concepts. Okay, so outside of matrilineality, Egypt or Kemet had a stronger commitment to equal protection, specifically through legal personhood. So beyond matriarchy, beyond how many queens they have, beyond the fact that power seemed to emanate from the female control of agriculture and thus the queen mother and real property passing down from queen mother to daughter, legal persons from the very beginning, from the first dynasties, the women were able to sue and be sued, to own property on their own, and to sue their fathers or their brothers or whomever for property unlawfully withheld to them. It's astounding. This is not practiced, as far as we know, anywhere else in the world. Now, understand that there aren't really that many states elsewhere in the world around 3000, 4000 BC. The dating of Egypt is very controversial. I'm not going to get into a lot of that. Early 3000, 2000, 2500 doesn't really matter to me because it's so far back and so prior to it happening, statehood and this type of political governance happening anywhere else in the world. So I'm not going to quibble over dates other than to say that we know at least 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, women in Egypt were their own legal person who could own property and also go to court, sue on their own behalves against husbands, against fathers. There was divorce law in Old Kingdom Egypt, and we note that that all the writers agree that Egypt had never gotten back to its legal sophistication with respect to equal protection, especially as to gender, as it did in its first 6 dynasties, aka the Old Kingdom, that which lasted anywhere between 4000 BC and 2500 BC. Again, you can dispute the dates. It's not a problem for me. However, women were their own, could receive property, they could sue in court, and a lot of the lawsuits, and there's lots of them, one of the reasons we know so much about it is because they had so many courts and so many lawsuits, and they kept records of these things. The law was ubiquitous in ancient Egypt, and the orderliness of society, so many occupations and whatnot. It wasn't just farmer, castle owner, and that's it. We had professional trades and all types of stuff. Anyway, one thing I do need to note about this legal personhood and this commitment to contract law in ancient Egypt, divorce law, family law, was wills. Wills were fantastic. It is something to be proud of, this legal sophistication, but they also were a way in which the northern part of Egypt starts to assert itself. And when I say the northern part, we're talking about the lower delta, lower Egypt, that closest to the Mediterranean, that closest to Asia and Europe. And those peoples from those groups that migrated into Egypt were from patrilineal systems, or often patrilineal systems. They were also called Semitic, meaning that there was a mixture, because again, we know that Africans ventured outside of and had colonies and trading depots. Egypt had officials that were in Palestine and other places as early as the first dynasties. There's a whole history before the Egyptian pharaohs. Okay, and so we know that northern peoples are starting to come down from Northern Europe, Northern Asia, and mixed, and they are instituting patrilineal systems, right, where the male is the head of the household, where all the property is male, where the right to rule follows the male line. And we'll see that the drawing of a will in ancient Egypt is a means to actually subvert African cultural unity as far as matrilineality and matriarchy is concerned. How? Well, when you die without a will, that's when culture jumps in, right? To die intestate or die, the default rule is the cultural rule, which is matrilineal. So if a man dies, all of his property, especially personal property, would go not to his own sons, but to his nephews, the sons and daughters of his sister, right? Because again, it's going from queen mother. All that I do is not for myself. It is in respect of the household, in respect of the queen mother. Now, the more I take a wife and create my own family, and I have my own children that I am quite certain that are mine, because again, if we're talking about land and whatnot, outside of the nobility without marriage contracts, paternity can be a complicated thing. But to the extent we're married, right, we have a marriage contract, and these marriage contracts often represented wealthy families and what's going to happen to the property thereof. There becomes an incentive there to subvert, to say instead of it going from me to my nephews, it is to go from me to my eldest son or my children or daughters or sons, daughters, etc. So the natural objects of my bounty. So here we already see where this the advancement of written contract, and we're going to attribute this a little more to the north than the south because of papyrus, right? The reason Egypt is more committed to writing than other African societies at the time is because of papyrus. It's not because of certain genius or what have you. Other African societies wrote, they had language and whatnot, but papyrus, the vast amounts of papyrus that was torn into paper allowed for the society to really commit to writing greater than any others, to the south or to the east or to the west or to the north. So this idea of wills being a means to subvert African cultural unity also occurs inside the house of the pharaohs when we get to the New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty. 19th dynasty, 20th dynasties. Here, instead of allowing the Council of State, the Queen Mother, to certify the eligible new rulers, the eligible heirs, and having a Council of State, including the priests of Amon, the military commander-in-chief, other high government officials, or primary cabinet levels, having their traditional power to elect this king. Here now we see co-regencies where pharaohs are selecting the child that they want to rule after them and installing them as a co-regent while I'm still king, so that you get used to it. So as soon as I die, this person takes over. But that can cause a problem if the South is looking to the Queen Mother and her children to lead next, while the North, Lower Egypt, is looking to that male child of the king. And so any of our intermediate periods, or that competition between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and having two distinct pharaohs during intermediate periods, often stems from this clash of culture of matrilineality and patrilineality, where the Nubian South, the Theban South, again, is looking to the Queen Mother, who is Nubian, who represents Egypt and the land proper, and her offspring being the only legitimate heirs to the throne, versus the North, who is looking to have sons. And here we have sons that are the sons of princesses. This is an important part. Sons that are the children of princesses adopted or brought in from Syria, from Palestine, from Elam, from societies north Libya, from the Hittites, right? So to have political unities, they would actually have harems and hostages, where I bring your children, children of the king, princes and princesses of the kings of these other northern Asiatic peoples, bring them into the courts of Egypt, and hopefully negotiate that child, the child of the Egyptian pharaoh and the, let's say, Syrian princess, becomes the new pharaoh. That can only happen if you're doing patrilineality, not matrilineality. And so there we have, again, the North asserting itself, the Mediterranean, Asian North, European North, distinguishing itself from the African South, and whether the African South can hold on. And when I say hold on, what do I mean? Again, taxes, right? It's always about taxes. Can I extract taxes from you and then keep the functioning of the state wealthy? By taxes, I have public building projects. I have the sophistication and the grandness of the state that attracts more people. More people bring in more taxes. And again, I keep it going. I keep a military with these taxes to keep everybody under control. And not only that, I redistribute all these other stuff. Because remember, African taxation, we're talking about economies where you grow cotton, you have cows and cattle, you have this type of produce, you have this type of produce, you have this type of produce. And so taxation is not just allegiance to the state. It is not just power. It is the way in which I'm going to get all the crafts of this province, this area, this area, this area, this area, this area, and redistribute it to all the other provinces so that the economy of the entire state is very, very sophisticated. I have what you have what I have. Now, I may have certain things in abundance, but again, that everyone has something close to all of the goods of the state is a very important duty of the king and the pharaoh in maintaining it. Continuing this talk about equal protection in ancient Kemet. Again, we talked about legal personhood, this ability to contract, to have divorces and be protected, to have wills, to earn, and to keep property, to be able to sue your father, your brother as a woman. Well, what about occupations, right? What about jobs, right? We just talked about the sophistication of Egypt being that it's not just peasant farmers. We talked about this in the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. The big thing about the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, or one of the big things about the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, is that he is a farmer. The pharaoh eventually gets involved. There's at least there's a appeals officer in the middle, the governor. There's also town officials. There's employees of these folks. The references in the tale, in his speech, reference all types of employees and a professional class, a working class, people that don't own property and own their livelihood to a combination of commerce and the state, as far as being employees who are fed, who can feed themselves by working for other people and have other people working under them, an elaborate bureaucracy. We see women in old kingdom professions, but not a great lot of them, but we do see them. We note that before we discover electricity and it brings into us this new era since the 18th, 19th, 20th century, child rearing is hard. And so the idea that the Queen Mother is also raising children, raising the next Horus, is highly respected and venerated. So the fact that men are, again, the action figures when it comes to occupation is not meant to discount the primary job of the nation is to sustain itself through the production of great, healthy children. So we note there that women are at the head of child rearing, and also agricultural in most of Africa is dominated by women. Now, we also have references to men with plows and plowing their fields. So we're not going to pretend that men were not a very integral part of agriculture and pastoralism and what have you. But we do know that women were very, very much involved in the agricultural lifestyle and how to maintain your farms and stuff. In city life, Again, Old Kingdom was preeminent, that you would find more women working in city life in the Old Kingdom, in the Middle Kingdom, and then they apparently practically disappear from public life in the New Kingdom, besides those who are vying for Queen Mother, or at least seen as Queen Mother, or vying to be the regent, the co-regent, or even the pharaoh herself. But in the Old Kingdom, it's very interesting to note that physicians, doctors, was a female class. So there were both, and we know of Thoth, I'm sorry, not Thoth, Imhotep, as apparently the god venerated as the real father of medicine long before the Greeks. Again, the physicians themselves were often women, and there's so many papyruses and other evidence and records about Egyptian medicine. It's a great, we'll have to do another video on that, because it shows again the modernity and sophistication of black folks getting down 5,000-6,000 years ago. Other places you would see women in control of things, running things, would be in the palace with regard to the choirs and the bands and the orchestra. Now again, if you think about it, you don't see this too much in the movies, but if you see Egypt and Kemet and from its African interior, it's very natural that we would have royal choirs and bands and orchestra, that one of the principal things that would entertain the pharaoh would be music, and entertain the palace, because the palace also includes the other administrators, the overseer of the archives, the overseer of the military, the overseer of the granaries, the overseer of taxes and whatnot. So it would be a huge, elaborate structure, and within it, bands, orchestras, royal choirs, and women were sometimes the head of those, and we might presume that means that they were over or superior to men, which again would put that be extraordinary for its time, and extraordinary as it relates or is compared to other areas of the world at that time, and even thousands of years after. In religious life, we need to find out more, or at least I need to find out more, again, about the cult of Isis, the daughters of Amun. So you understand that when we talk about the priesthoods in Egypt or any place, let's remember that even Europe was run by the Pope at certain points, that when state apparatus breaks down, when the nobility when it becomes very feudalistic, where there isn't a central government, there's just basically rich people with castles that can protect themselves, and the farmers that are around them. That's a feudal system, right? There's really no central government. There's very little authority. There's really to levy taxes so that everybody has a national identity, and there's a protection of the entire group. Lots of city-states in Europe and in Asia and what have you operated in this fashion. But even in Egypt, during some of the intermediate periods, especially after the fall of the New Kingdom, the priests of Amun, they become much more powerful, and who they select as the daughters of Amun or the son of Amun then becomes the religious figure that everyone reveres. And again, that means they have authority to lay and collect taxes on the people who are supposed to be believers or worshipers. It's not just about being in awe. It is about this authority to take a portion of what you grow from the earth for the state, so that we can then have public works projects, armies, whatever you want to call it. So legal personhood, occupations, women in the Old Kingdom were more involved in their societies than other societies of their time, of which there are not many, although again, we're not focusing on what perhaps is going on in the Americas, what's going on in Asia and China. We hope to find out that there's a lot more than we've been introduced to this point. So let's talk about matriarchy, right? Then how about the kings and queens, this idea that there are female pharaohs leading up to Hatshepsut? Well, there were at least 5 female pharaohs of ancient Egypt who ruled publicly as such, right? They are known, they're in the records, they're recited by Manetho and others as being pharaohs of Egypt. Mernith, Nitocris, Sebek-Neferu, Hatshepsut, and Tuasret, right? Mernith, Nitocris, Sebek-Neferu, Hatshepsut, the great Empress Hatshepsut, and Tuasret were 5 named pharaohs in Egyptian history. There's been a number of other women who seem to be either queen mothers and royal sisters who also served as regent or co-regent of Egypt. So let's say like King Tut, he was chosen as a child, right? And while he's a child, he can't run things. So the question becomes, is it does the queen mother, is a royal sister, who is the most able to lead the nation while the future king is in his infancy? And if it's an elected thing, then we can kind of assume that if you've elected a child, you kind of already are doing so probably for the purpose of having a woman be recognizing that some woman, either the queen mother or a royal sister, is the most able, and in order to put it in her hands, we're going to select this child and have her basically be his trustee and be the actual power of the kingdom. Again, we're going to see in Hatshepsut time in the Middle Kingdom, or in the New Kingdom, there's going to be this question of whether the future pharaohs or pharaohs were marrying their sisters, because it was clearly recognized that the sister or the royal sister or the queen mother was the legitimacy flowed through her, and yet the son of the king, who was anointed as co-regent by his father, had to, in order to be recognized by the South, by Upper Egypt, by Nubia, by Ethiopia, by Punt, where the majority of the trade was, we'll talk about that later. In order to be recognized by them, you got to be somehow connected to the real princess, the real queen, not the son of the king. So it's really interesting when Kemet becomes a world power under Hatshepsut, how that's dealt with. Okay, so let's go back to our first Egyptian or Kemetic queen, the very first dynasty. The very first Egyptian dynasty is created. We have Narmer, or the Scorpion King, or Menes. Some people say it's all one person. Some people say it's different people. But we know that the South comes up, Upper Egypt comes up and subdues Lower Egypt. When we say subdues them, what are we saying? They can lay taxes. We have the military power. We are united in the sense that you now have to pay me taxes. My court and whatnot is going to travel around the country to show our power, and we're going to take a piece of what you have grown. We're also going to then give you back gifts, things from other parts of the empire, so that you will be very happy. And one of the things I can give you, especially if I control the South, if I control Nubia, or at least have a very good relationship with Nubia and the African interior, I have gold. Right, and that ability to muster the gold of the South, the gold of the African interior, and basically pay, return that out to the provinces in return for their taxes and employees and stuff like that, makes Egypt great. But it also makes Egypt very vulnerable, as people outside of Egypt, they want control, they want the gold that you have, and they want the gold that you control. So the very first dynasty comes up from the South, subdues the North, lays the taxes. We are pretty sure that in the pre-dynastic era, that Nubia, the Nile Valley south of Egypt, has already entered in this pharaonic period themselves, that there's a unity between Upper Egypt and Nubia at times pre-recorded. But we also want to note that there are distinctions. Lower Egypt sees itself as sort of a people. Upper Egypt sees itself as a people. Lower Nubia sees itself often as a people. Upper Nubia, again, the Nile goes from the lowest point at the Mediterranean. Well, I'm sorry, not where it ends up. Let's say it starts in the highlands of Ethiopia. It starts in the mountains of Ethiopia. It starts in the mountains of Uganda. Two different branches. So the interior Central Africa, the highlands of East Africa near the Red Sea, and it comes down and forms one river at Khartoum in present-day Sudan, and then keeps coming down, and notice we're saying down river until we get to the Mediterranean Delta. Also note that Africa, they saw themselves, the south, as north. So you would have Ethiopia as up. You would have Uganda in the interior as up, and the waters coming down, right, to basically the Nile Delta that lets out in the Mediterranean. It's kind of like the asshole of Africa if you look at it from that point of view. So we're going to note that, again, usually culture comes down the river. However, the different cataracts, and that represent the different levels, often represent different peoples. And so maintaining an empire, control of all of the Nile, is an accomplishment. And then we'll also talk about the Red Sea, which goes to their east. Okay, so after Narmer joins southern and northern Egypt, the very next dynasty ruler after Narmer's death is Neith-Hotep, a woman. She rules the land while Pharaoh Djer was a child. Right, so again, so she seems to be our first queen mother of Egypt, and also a region. Again, those from an Afrocentric perspective, some will argue that the daughter, that Nubians, when they were in control of Egypt, often appointed royal sisters as the rulers of Egypt, or at least Upper Egypt, when we can consider them Nubian or Tasseti or the Ta-Nehisi's. So it's interesting here that Neith-Hotep is a woman who rules right after Narmer's death, while Pharaoh Djer was a child, right? And then after Djer does become a pharaoh, he is succeeded by another woman, Mer-Neith, right? The name Mer-Neith means beloved of Neith, right? And as a matter of fact, apparently she is of such renown that she is the basis of the Greek god Athena. So we don't have a great deal, or I don't have a great deal about her particular exploits, but she is so venerated that she becomes revered as a goddess later in her life. Or I'm sorry, later in the life of Egypt and in the Mediterranean, what have you. Here's something written about her. Mer-Neith had two great tombs built, one in the southern Egypt city of Abydos, the other in the northern city of Saqqara. Tradition dictated that these monuments be built to symbolize the authority of the pharaoh as ruler of the north and the south, lower and upper Egypt. Her monuments, especially the Saqqara tomb, are as large and as impressive as those of the male pharaohs. So not only does she rule outright, the people after she dies celebrates her no different than they would have a male pharaoh. So from that's the first dynasty, right? The first series of kings and queens that come from a particular queen mother. And the interesting thing about that queen mother could have been alive through several of those rulers, right? Each time one passes or becomes ineffective, that her during her lifetime, that she is to certify nephews or sons or what have you of herself or her daughters that become eligible to be the next king or even queen. Now in the third, so we have another dynasty, the second dynasty, then the one that we know most about become the third dynasties and the fourth dynasties. These are the builders of the Sphinx. These are the builders of the Great Pyramids, right? Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, Djedefre. This is the era of the great vizier Imhotep, right? And the vizier again is not only the chief justice, he's the prime minister and also the architect. What am I going to do with all these taxes, right? I take these taxes and we create these large buildings which keeps the people occupied. You can only farm during a certain period of the year in Egypt, and so to control the population over those other periods of time, we would build pyramids and these halls and these temples. That way you could actually supplement your income from farming by working as an employee or craftsman dealing with these great public works projects. And as time goes on, those that don't have land could be full-time employees and totally dependent on the state or the church to have these great public work projects to employ people. And then we have a very, very citified system. So that's occurring through the third, fourth, fifth dynasties, right? This growth of Egypt is this power. We know that that Egypt is expanding, and so by the sixth dynasty, Egypt is very wealthy and it's very wide. However, when as wide as it becomes, keeping that type of power over a large land mass proves very difficult. We know that by the end of Menkare's reign, the local nomarchs, again, we descend often into feudalism, where the people that run the towns, the people that runs the provinces are powerful enough, they're wealthy enough that they don't want to pay taxes to the state. And the state does not have enough taxes to make them. And there we have this lessening of national identity and more localization. And we have more localization. What do we not have? This exchange of produce, this exchange of goods from one end of the kingdom to the next. Less trade means less wealth, less enjoyment, or whatever, and that's where we come to these intermediate periods. Meanwhile, but the world is getting larger. Egypt is now not only the only player out there. Its statehood is inspiring others, and so even documents from this sixth dynasty, Pepe and other pharaohs, travel to Punt. We know that Punt exists. We know that and that's beyond not just Nubia and Ethiopia. We're talking all the way down to Kenya. And we're likely using our boats on the Red Sea. So we're on the Nile on the one hand, but then we also, because of this sophistication of navigation and sailing, able to go down the Red Sea and the eastern coast of Africa and trade with Kenya. They also imported bears from Syria, right? So going up Palestine, up through Lebanon, all the way up to Syria, and then even towards what present-day Turkey, where the Hittites would have lived. The Egyptians are expanding. Kemet is expanding that far. They have diplomatic relations with Crete. And they war with Libya, who they often depict as white skin. And so Nitocris is the second woman to officially be named pharaoh in the sixth dynasty. Unfortunately, she's named pharaoh, and there seems to be no eligible male that is respectable enough to carry on the legacy. And then we have after her the very first intermediate period. And again, by intermediate period, we seem to have a king of Lower Egypt, a king of Upper Egypt, maybe some others. They were asked for short times. Maybe we have war between the two, or maybe they just have gone their own separate ways, but we don't have a central authority that's ruling over both Upper and Lower Egypt through taxation, through military power, through this redistribution principle of a grand economy. The first intermediate period, during the time of the sixth, the local provinces or nomarchs became more powerful, especially those in the north near the Mediterranean Delta. Now that's a Eurocentric focus on the Delta. But while national power was weakening in the north, I'm reciting from a source here. While national power was weakening in the north, Pepe II apparently conquered lands further to the south, include Wawat, which is basically Lower Nubia, Urthet, and Punt. So the sixth dynasty, even though it's losing the north, The Theban dynasty, again, Upper Egypt, seems to have a closer connection to Nubia, Ethiopia, Punt, and Southern Africa, and it seems to be becoming something of an African empire. And the question for this African empire is how much control can it exert over Lower Egypt and the Levant or Saudi Arabia, and all the way up the Asia Minor to the Euphrates. So, however, the nobility and the priesthood in Egypt avoided taxes and left the state without ability to sustain itself. After Nitocris's reign, calamity ensued. So here we have a quote about the first intermediate period. During the first intermediate period, nomarchs organized raids on other regions to plunder food. Peasants were forced to arm themselves. Again, since we don't have that redistribution principle, how am I going to get things other than what I grow? Well, some people would just take it, right? You don't have the power to regulate the roads, regulate farming, regulate craftsmanship, regulate military. The admonitions of Ipuwer, for example, describes the revolt of the poor and the invasions from Asia. They were lots of the writings are very concerned about Asia and these people from Asia, foreigners coming into Egypt and not respecting the culture. A man regards his son as his enemy. The tribes of the desert have become Kemites everywhere. What the ancestors foretold has arrived at fruition. It's interesting they say what the ancestors foretold. Again, this is perhaps this is a reference to Ptah-hotep, who again his admonitions are based on the idea that not following the rule of law is going to lead to decline and demise. The land is full of confederates, and a man goes to plow with his shield. Indeed, hearts are violent, pestilence is everywhere, blood is throughout the land, death is not lacking, and the mummy cloth speaks even before one comes near it. So we can't even maintain the royal necropolises, right? The idea that, the pyramids and these burial temples that are protected, that protect the wealth, they're being run over. Indeed, the land turns around like a potter's wheel. The robber is a possessor of riches, and a rich man has become a plunderer. Barbarians from abroad have come to Kemet. Those who were Kemets have become foreigners and are thrust aside, and the man of rank can no longer be distinguished from him who is nobody. All is ruined. What's not discussed is the gold, right? That whoever these foreigners are that come and invade and take over and enslave people and seem to take them back up north into the Asiatic ones, they don't seem to change anything about the political system or the pharaohs or whatnot. They seem to just be plunderers, that we're going to raid you guys and take what we want and leave. Not rule it our way, not impose any new Asian culture on it. Although, again, we do see one facet of Asian culture, patriarchy, seeming to inject itself. But as far as writing styles and the political systems and dress and all types of things, Egypt seems to be culturally superior, and it's the foreigners that seem to adopt their systems as they leave. They don't seem to carry on very far, but they definitely don't impose new stuff over Egypt. They seem to just be plunderers. So that sets up the return. And the return, again, comes from the south. Like Narmer, the first dynasty, like later, the Nubian 25th dynasty, the 11th dynasty is started by Mentuhotep. He marches up from the south to unite the country from the first cataract on the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea once again. The Amenemhet the first was the vizier to the fourth Mentuhotep, and he becomes pharaoh. Because again, he became the vizier instead of a child of the queen mother. Then his wife or mother becomes a new queen mother that then inspires a new dynasty, the 12th dynasty. It's been said, I'm going to recite some words. Before the 12th dynasty period, historians recognize only two organized states on the planet Earth, Nubia and Egypt. During the 12th dynasty period, states would appear for the first time in Asia. So again, there were city-states, there were people. Let's not say that they weren't people. There were people, countries, whatever you want to call them, tribes, but here now we have states. Of these, Sumer, located in modern Iraq, emerged around 3300 BC. Elam, located in modern Iran. Akkad in Iran and Syria, right? This is off the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, right? These civilizations all seem to be stabilized during rivers because there's agriculture, is plentiful food, whereas the space in between the Nile and the Euphrates River is sometimey, right? Whether or not it's going to be fertile, it could be for several decades, but then turn around and be very arid. Whereas along the Euphrates rivers, the Tigris rivers, the Nile River, there's always food every year. Maybe not as much one year as the next, but it becomes the stable civilizations because they can produce food and attract people and then become more sophisticated. There's also, with controversial exception of Crete, there were no other known civilizations on the planet Earth on this date. And note that even though we're talking about Asiatics or what have you, if you have access to the internet or anywhere, of course you have if you're watching this, go find the book When Egypt Ruled the East. It was published by the University of Chicago, and its illustrations of Asiatic and Egyptian people is wonderful. It definitely shows you the dark brown complexion. And so we know that Egyptians began to think of themselves as different than native Nubians or even those from sub-Saharan Africa, and would paint them as extremely black, but they also painted themselves as very, very, very dark brown, and also the Semitic races as dark brown. So to the extent I, as an African American, am lighter than many of my brothers in Africa, again, it doesn't suggest that I am somehow white. Even now, again, we'll talk later about phenotype and race as a concept or a construct, and we'll try to do away with this idea of darker or lighter having the primary signifier of what race is. But know that the Egyptians saw themselves as special, but they also did see themselves as African people, at least Upper Egypt. And we see, again, through the 12th dynasty, this unity of southern Egypt with Nubia. Now, there's often talk about about how the Egyptians conquered Nubia, which can be the case, certainly can be the case. We're not suggesting that they were always on friendly relations. However, some of these wars seem to be, on the one hand, to bring Nubia into the fold, but others of these wars seem to be Nubia seceding, Nubia, Punt, Ethiopia seceding from Egypt when Egypt becomes what they feel is too Asian or too European, or not faithful to the past that was established in the old kingdom. We see when the new kingdom devolves, the later pharaohs of the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and all that, they don't seem to be all that concerned about continuing on pharaonic culture, whereas the Nubians after 1000 BC, after the 25th dynasty, are the ones that carry on the culture, the mummification, the creation of pyramids, matrilineality, matriarchy, and then spread it throughout the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So consistent with the Old Kingdom dynasties, the Middle Kingdom's 12th dynasty also had at least two female rulers. Neferupta, the daughter of Amenemhet II, had a burial suggesting that she was a head of state. Now, it suggests that she was a head of state, but the records don't necessarily call her the daughter of Ammon and ruler of the two lands, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. But she does seem to be buried in a way that makes her special, that made her above just the queens or the wives of the pharaohs. That this daughter, perhaps she became a queen mother. After Amenemhet the fourth, the last ruler of the 12th dynasty was a woman, Sebek Neferu. And again, we see that this is the old end of a dynasty, perhaps again because the lower Egyptians are in the upper Egyptians, the south versus the north, is in conflict as to who has the legitimate right to move forward. If there's a growing presence in Asia, in Lower Egypt in the north, they may be looking for a son of the previous pharaoh to take over and the throne, where the south is looking for the queen mother to certify it, and the priests of Ammon and others to select this council of state. And there we have, and when those are in disagreement, we have a pharaoh of Lower Egypt and a pharaoh of Upper Egypt, and another so-called intermediate period. Here we have, unlike the Old Kingdom, we can distinguish a brief trade in slaves in this period. There were not enough military undertakings to explain the ever-growing number of Asiatic slaves in Egypt. I mention that specifically because, again, we're talking ultimately about equal protection of the law. And as much as I am going to argue that pre-colonial Africa was at its best when it respected equal protection of the law when it comes to gender, religion, etc., even class, we also would then note that the opposite, whether the opposite is true, whether the disrespect for equal protection leads to a downfall, whether treating foreigners or Asiatics inconsistent with the principles of Mat, right? The tale of the eloquent peasant is so deep because it says that the Kun Anup is going into Kemet, that he seems to be an outsider. And again, whether he's just a citizen of Lower Egypt, whether he's coming from outside, whether he's Asian, whether he's African, we don't know. But Mat is asking, the principles of Mat and the tale of the eloquent peasant is over and again that everyone is to be treated equally. So here, this idea that there are Asiatic slaves in Egypt in a growing number suggests that we are using them to create greater wealth inconsistently with the principles of Mat. We're taking money over Mat when it should be Mat over money. And again, these growing amount of slaves, the more they get included, they bring their culture with them. They get integrated into society, especially those that have merit. But they don't have the same allegiance to the state and have a similar allegiance to others. And so here we think we see the rise of what's called the Hyksos. The Hyksos are a peoples who we believe, or at least I believe, they seem to be distinguished from the Semitic tribes. The Egyptians know who the Assyrians are. They know who the Palestinians are. They know who the Phoenicians are. But they don't give them these names. They call them the Hyksos, or the shepherd kings, or the rulers of foreign lands, which either suggests a new people we haven't heard of, or an amalgamation, an aggregation of not just Asian, but now European, Libyan peoples that all see Egypt as the place of their subjugation. Right? That as Egypt is expanded of all these places, they are either being, on the one hand, they could just be jealous and this is where the wealth is and we're going to take it. On the other hand, the idea that there are slaves in Egypt of Asiatic origin suggests that Egypt is going far and wide and is exerting its power over the Mediterranean, over Western Asia, Asia Minor, all the way to the Euphrates. And so the Hyksos come in and lay waste to Egypt and actually rule. They don't just plunder. They do plunder, but they rule over Egypt, and especially Lower Egypt, for at least 100 years. They enslave the people. They actually even go down to parts of Nubia because, again, why? The gold, right? They know that that's where the luxury items, not just gold, but then elephants and crocodiles, ivory and others, and also that they now re-enslave black folks and bring them out of Africa to have them serve in Asia and in parts of southwestern Europe and whatnot. So the second intermediate period is a horrific one, and it's so horrific on southern Egypt, Nubia, Punt, etc. They are so well subjugated and conquered that it burns in their minds, and their response to it, there's a unification under the god Amon that is intense and that seems to span from Egypt all the way down to Kenya. And then, in order to prevent the Hyksos from returning again, Egypt expands all the way up to Syria and enforces the god Amon amongst all people from top to bottom. It becomes one of the greatest empires the world's ever seen, and at the head of it is a queen, Queen Hatshepsut, right? Queen Hatshepsut is the head of this empire that stretches basically all the way from Syria, perhaps even Turkey, perhaps even as far as Greece, if Martin Bernal is to be believed, as far as Egypt having these colonies that become the beginning of Greece, all the way down past Nubia, through Egypt, all the way down to Punt or Kenya. A vast, vast empire where the emeralds and the jewels of the north, the cedarwood trees of Lebanon are incorporated in the state, no different than the crocodiles of the interior and the gold mines of Nubia lends to just great wealth. Now, let me say that one of these ways we get here is because of the conquering of the Hyksos. The Hyksos introduce chariots and horses into warfare into Africa. Okay, so prior to that, Tasseti and all that, the bow and arrow, having superior forces, that was the way in which Egypt conquered. But you can only go so far. And again, the time and the time that you have to get there is limited. But somewhere in North Asia, somewhere, somebody jumps on the back of a horse and makes the horse do what it wants them to do, he or she wants it to do, and that raises a whole new level of military warfare. It takes it to a whole nother level. Not only that, if we add the chariot, it's also to it, where I can fight. I have speed, but I can also fight with bow and arrow, with sword, along with my infantrymen. So the Hyksos used this superior military technology to subjugate Africa, but Africans or Cometians are not stupid. They learn the tricks of the trade, and they adopt the horse and chariot and run the Hyksos back out. Akhmos is the first general, again, to start from the south and kick the Hyksos out of the north. His son Kamos is the second military leader to adopt the horse and chariot and then push them Hyksos further and further out and create basically what's now called the 18th dynasty. Right, the 18th dynasty, the dynasty of the Amenhoteps and the Tutmoses, right? And they are big empire builders, right? So with this chariot, with this horse and chariot, with and the wealth of Egypt, imagine you are in Punt, right? You're in Kenya, you're in Syria, you're in Palestine, you're in some of these desert areas that have some agriculture but don't have very impressive buildings, or maybe some. And now with horse and chariot, the Queen Mother appears with an entourage to collect the taxes from her subordinate vassal states. The spectacular nature of this queen had to be most impressive, especially to the extent that she's now identified again with Isis, with Hathor, with Mot, all of these female goddesses, and dripping in gold and jewels. It comes, we can understand why these countries now in Asia, in Western Asia, Palestine, Assyria, Acadia, become enthralled and then part of the Egyptian state. Also, Hatshepsut is also not just a example herself of equal protection in the fact that she names herself the daughter of Ammon, the fact that she calls her, that she is recognized as a pharaoh outright. She's also an integrationist. By creating this grand empire, she takes Egypt from what's called a beginning state where only the ruling family becomes the vizier and control of all the state apparatus, to a intermediate state, which the 4th or 5th or 6th dynasties were immediate states. Imhotep is not related to Khufu or Sneferu, right? He is his own man, but he's also within the ethnic group, the ruling ethnic group. So that's an intermediate state. The 18th dynasty comes along, and Hatshepsut has Asian. She has this. And again, it's a controversy. She basically is on the scene almost throughout Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, 3 successive rulers that she is accredited to be either the wife or sister or mother. The stories can get a little convoluted, but she's the consistent part through all of it, right? And the buildings created towards her veneration are so utterly grand that it's, whether she's the queen mother, whether she is the pharaoh herself, whether she is the royal wife, she is a hugely impressive figure. And she seems adept at incorporating all the elements of the empire into the state apparatus. So she is not only a unifier of all these states and now new provinces of Egypt, and the collector of these taxes, and then all this great wealth that comes from it. She's also the great integrator. She seems to be an integrationist. She is renowned for also having these Asiatic folks and people of poorer birth, so not just foreign but poor class, in the state apparatus, making it an advanced state. Not just the family members, not just the ethnic group, but whoever has the greatest amount of merit becomes the vizier or a viceroy or an overseer. When we say that they created this empire, there's even 2 viceroys, right? From the modest times almost to the present time, Egyptian trade was chiefly directed towards the lands of the Upper Nile and the Sudan, and this could be successfully maintained only if these regions themselves and all the connecting desert routes were under Egyptian control. So basically they're saying that the wealth of Egypt always laid in the south, in the gold mines, in the luxury items. Then they traded these things for stuff in the north, and the people in the north had their own things that were attractive: copper, bears, things that you couldn't find in Egypt. But the most of the stuff that was valuable was from inner Africa. And so when they also conquer the north, then there becomes how do we govern this vast territory? And where we had a vizier or prime minister, Imhotep and Ptahhotep, govern all of Egypt underneath the pharaoh, here now we're having 2 viceroys, 2 viziers, one for the Mediterranean north and one for the African south. And to establish legitimacy over all of them, we are the religion of Ammon, right? The god of Black Africa. And we say this because in the Middle Kingdom, in the Old Kingdom, gods represented each of their cities, right? So Hathor, Re, Ra, Osiris, and what could represent a particular town. And we recognize my God versus your God versus your God versus my God. But here's the interesting thing about the rise of the Hyksos. The Hyksos did us so badly, came in and conquered Egypt and pushed us down into the African interior and subjugated so much that the return required unification under the god Amon, who again was basically the Theban god, right? So all of the other gods remain, but Amon becomes the hidden god, right? The hidden god from which everyone else comes from. And honestly, this becomes perhaps monotheism before even the Aten that we speak of when it comes Akhenaten. We'll leave that again for the second. But again, this northern expansion under Hatshepsut in the 15th century BC, the ancient world had for the first time achieved an important system of international trade. Its routes connected the Sudan with Asia Minor and continued from the Tigris and Euphrates to the coast of Syria, the islands of the Aegean Sea, and the mainland of Greece. Just as Egyptian domination put an end to Babylonian political influence, so it likewise replaced the Mesopotamian cultural supremacy somewhat later. As a result, a peculiar mixed culture and art developed in Phoenicia and the Aegean world, etc. So again, Egypt rules the East at this point, right? The Asia Minor, the Levant. We have some evidence that maybe even over with Saudi Arabia, but it is the world power, and it is and Thutmose III or Thutmose III is the male figure that is credited most with those warlike successes. However, throughout that whole period, again, Hatshepsut is at the top. She is either the wife, the queen mother, or what have you, and things are changing. Things are becoming much more metropolitan. The simple fashions of dress for men and women alike, which had remained essentially unchanged from the earliest times, a basic white robe, now vanished to be replaced with more elegant styles. And we see this metropolitanism, this flossing, also seems to suggest, at least to others, softness. And so after this huge rise, how do we protect it from a downfall? As I mentioned, though, at this time, Hatshepsut is the great unifier. She's the great integrationist. She is not only a representative of equal protection as far as matriarchy, she treats everyone equally within the state, or at least trying to set that example. It was said, again, that the larger Egyptian cities were by this time swarming with Semitic tribesmen who either had been brought into the Nile Valley as hostages, prisoners of war, or slaves, or had immigrated voluntarily to engage in trade. Many of these, in the course of time, rose to high positions in the government in the 18th dynasty. Foreigners brought with them other gods, Baal, Astarte, Kadesh, but until at length they were accorded official recognition and were honored by the offerings of native Egyptian worshippers. So at this time, again, as it becoming an empire, they're accepting these new religions. There seems to be, again, an equality in treatment of those from the north to those from the south. Again, Thutmose III is the one that first appoints two different viziers, one for upper, one for lower, so that everyone can be treated equally, regardless of alienage, gender, and to some respect, class. Hatshepsut even had an Asian prime minister. Perhaps one of the viziers was Asian, Senenmut. And by the name Senenmut, with Mut at the end, there's also a question of whether this prime minister or this vizier was a woman, because Mut was a female goddess. So his sister, the god's wife, Hatshepsut, and again, sister, wife, mother, it's really confusing as to the Thutmose's relationship with Hatshepsut, but we know she's powerful. governed the land. The two lands were at her will and served her. Egypt was in submission, for she was a dictator excellent of plans, who reassured the two regions by her speaking. Again, by her speaking, the idea that she traveled to Punt. She did, in fact, go to Punt. And established more trading relationships, and basically, again, that incorporated them within the empire. She took the name Kamare. Moreover, in addition to these qualities, she had the unusual good fortune to possess in the person of the official Senenmut, an advisor and chancellor who was able to encourage her thirst for power and to carry out her plans. Of humble origin, right? So that's again a reference to class. Of humble origin, Senenmut had in early youth entered service in the Temple of Amun at Karnak, and before very long had successively occupied a series of important posts, right? Started from the bottom, worked self up to the top. We know only that she heaped upon him endless honors such as had never been found in the writing of the ancestors, and that she appointed him to be the tutor, or as the Egyptian expressed it, the great nurse of her daughter, the princess Neferre. Again, the great nurse of her daughter, the idea that physicians were often a female occupation, that the name ends in mut, suggests, doesn't prove, I'll look it up further, that Senenmut was perhaps a woman. But to the extent Senenmut is a man, it also begs the question of whether, was this her husband? Did queens have harems? Or at least this 18th century, are we witnessing the pinnacle of equal protection, where a queen rules as any man would, with harems, with multiple husbands or whatnot? Is that possible? Not sure. We know that her and Thutmose are related. Are they husband and wife? Are they sister? Does he have several wives and she have several husbands? Is this this a consort? It's very, very interesting, especially when we also consider that we may have a situation where Hatshepsut is the royal sister, Thutmose is the pharaoh, and that each still have equal powers within the kingdom. Why? Again, because the female figure of Hatshepsut is what is venerated over the entire empire. Remember her travels all over there, that we all serve the queen mother. The pharaoh is supposed to be under the queen, who calls herself the daughter of Amun. And so legitimacy flowing through her. But again, this Asian, regardless of the relationship, we do know that this Senenmut was an Asian prime minister that was not of noble rank, that rose up through to be one of the great politicians or great bureaucrats within Egypt. Perhaps a story similar to Joseph in the Bible, who rose up from a prisoner to be the interpreter of dreams, or as I like to call him, the chief economist. So again, this confusion as to whether Hatshepsut is the outright queen. We know she was outright queen or outright pharaoh. But again, her relationship to Thutmose the first, Thutmose the second, Thutmose the third. Was she just running through dudes? Was she appointing these folks as the queen mother and then doing away with them? Okay, again, we're just speculating at this point. But what we do know is that after Hatshepsut, we have the reign of the Amenhoteps, and including Queen T, right? So Queen T steps onto the scene, and she, again, is more than just a passive queen mother. In the next, I'm going to read again another passage. In the next episode, Amun approaches the great royal wife, Mutumwiya, and beats the royal child already created by Khnum. In the temple of Soleb in Nubia, where Amenhotep III was worshipped as the living image of Ra on earth, and in the Nubian town of Sidenga, where Queen T was similarly honored in a chapel built for her worship. So again, is Queen T the great royal wife? And when we say royal wife, she's the wife of the pharaoh, which would make her somewhat subordinate. Is she the wife of Amun? Are we elevating her as a monarch to the great queen mother, the royal wife of Amun, the daughter of Amun? Because we know that these queens of this 18th dynasty are venerated far greater than any other queens. So how much authority they have is really astounding and subject to speculation. But Queen T, Queen Hatshepsut, these 18th dynasty women are phenomenal, right? Apparently, the young queen, who also was apparently a round-the-way girl, Amenhotep the fourth apparently chooses her as a queen, and so again the question becomes: is she the legitimate queen mother in a matrilineal society? Is the king trying to subvert that by having the power to name her the queen mother or the great royal wife? Is it working? The young queen apparently exercised considerable influence over her husband and played an important role in political life. She is frequently depicted on monuments beside her husband in a manner totally unprecedented in Egyptian art, and scarabs bearing the names of the king and queen side by side were commonly used as seals or amulets. Here's also another possibility. Again, we have two viceroys. We have the Northern Empire and the Southern Empire. And it seems that maybe the southern part of the empire has to see this representation of the Queen Mother or the female half of the pharaoh to know that the northern, more patriarchal system is not taking control. Right? Is it more important to the people to see a queen of Nubian and Upper Egyptian origin in this time, especially after they had just thrown off the yoke of the Hyksos, which they considered Asiatic and foreign peoples? After Queen T, we see Queen Nefertiti, who was the wife of Akhenaten IV. Whoo! Okay, if we're going to talk about Akhenaten and King Tut now. These are two pharaohs that you have heard of. Akhenaten, you have heard of him being the first pharaoh to adopt monotheism. Was a religious reformer. You have also heard of King Tut, his son, and the wealth that was found in his tomb. Especially when some of you are younger than I, but when I was young, in the 70s, 80s, King Tut's tomb and the wealth found in it set this world ablaze as far as the veneration of Egypt is concerned, and how great it actually was. So this empire is represented by such immense riches. But again, the wife of Akhenaten, Queen Nefertiti, is a central important figure who is very integral to part of the story. And especially with respect to Akhenaten, possibly on the one hand being a religious reformer, on the other hand being a pacifist, on the other hand, was he co-opted by the North, by Lower Egypt and Syria and Persia and those folks, right? When he left the Church of Amun, was that to place the god of Aton and swing power from the north and make it supreme, or was he trying to create a balance between the two? It's interesting because Queen Nefertiti, she seemed to be loyal to the Theban priesthood in Amun, and very readily after Akhenaten was run out, she turned her name back to, or I'm sorry, her son from Tut Akhenaten to Tutankhamun, right? Amun, right? Brought him back to the original religion of Amun, of Black Africa, of the South, the god, let's call him the god of the South. At this time, it's really interesting. I mentioned hostage princes, hostage harems. So now that Egypt has conquered the lands of Asia and even Europe, what they're trying to do is create alliances and control. First of all, control. These are patriarchal systems in Asia. And so once conquered, Egypt could decide, I could put someone in charge of your province, or I could allow you to continue your rule as a confederate, as a subordinate confederate, a vassal state. How am I also going to control you? First of all, you're going to pay me taxes. But secondly, a second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to demand that you give me at least one of your sons, your princes. And I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to treat him great. He's going to live in Egypt. He's going to live in the palace. And he's going to be wowed by how great Egypt is. And he's going to learn our system. And when you die, I know your system is patrilineal. I know that the son of the king can become the king. And so I am going to push, first of all, I'm going to push elections on you. That's amazing, right? I'm going to push elections on the Hittites and whatnot so that they can elect who? The prince that's favorable to Egypt. I'm going to send this prince in Egypt back home when the old king dies and hopefully install him as king through an election. And he's going to owe his allegiance to me, and therefore our relations are going to be good as this vassal or tributary state. The same with daughters, right? If they are a matrilineal system, then I want to basically kidnap or at least hold hostage, or intermarriage with the daughters. And we see Egyptians demanding daughters from these states to marry the pharaohs of Egypt. And then hopefully these women would produce a child who would be favorable to the to their foreign Asian state. But for that child, again, to become the pharaoh, we would have to change the system, because it's only the sons of a Nubian woman, of the queen mother, who is supposed to be eligible to the throne. So we see the Tutmoses. We also see the Amenhoteps try to get around this by choosing a son of one of their favorite wives, a foreign wife, as choosing that son as co-regent while they're alive. So that, and not only that, this production of scarabs almost as trading cards, now that the Egyptian world is becoming more literate, they're passing around these scarabs with the royal wife's face on it, so that the people will accept her as queen mother from north to south and east to west. And it seems to be creating a lot of controversy, right? So who becomes the ruler afterwards? And there's an interesting thing about Nefertiti and Akhenaten. After he's run out, Nefertiti changes Tutankhamun's name back to Tutankhamun, brings him back to the fold, right? But at the same time, he's a child, and there's a vizier, who seems to be running the show. Does he take over? Does Tutankhamun take over? Does a child of Nefertiti take over? Well, here's an interesting thing. Tutankhamun was married as he grew older. He grew up and he married a woman named Ankhesenaten. Right? This is before their conversion back to the Amun. Tutankhamun married a woman named Ankhesenaten. So when Tutankhamun goes back to Egypt, disavows the religion of the Aten, because while they're creating this religious order, the Aten, the northern princes, the lower Egypt, Syria, they stop paying taxes, they feel empowered, they feel emboldened. And the empire starts slipping away. The South is enraged, right? They see the lower Egypt, just like pre-dynastic times, slipping away from southern Egypt, and Akhenaten is letting them. So they're pissed, and they basically stage more or less of a coup, and have Tutankhamun and Nefertiti return to Thebes, return the monarchy to Thebes. But this second wife of Tutankhamun, Ankhesenaten, she's unsatisfied. She sends a letter. She wants to stay in Lower Egypt, sends a letter to the Hittites. The Hittites are all the way up near in Turkey at this point. but they're part of the Egyptian empire. And she says to the king of Hittite, please send me one of your princes whom I shall marry, and he shall be the king and the pharaoh of Egypt. So she's trying to make a play as queen mother of all of Egypt and hoping that the north can overtake the south, that she can take one of the Asian princes and install him as the king, perhaps similar to Hatshepsut. Is that why Hatshepsut they try to remove her likeness and images from Egyptian lore? Again, it's a very, very complicated story. Hopefully we'll iron it out, but Amun sends a letter to the Hittites saying, send me one of your princes, I'll marry him, and then we will rule Egypt, and that way you'll be in favor. They don't trust her, so they don't even answer her first letter, but she sends a second one. She is serious about being more or less a traitor to the state, a traitor to the Theban priesthood in Upper Egypt in the south. And so at this time, the Hittites say, okay, all right, we see a power move. Let's send one of our princes down there to marry her, and then we will assert, again, if she is thought of as the legitimate queen mother, then her husband will then be able to go around all of Egypt and lay taxes and bring that wealth back. And if the Hittites can basically lower their own taxes and get more of what's created in the rest of the state, especially the gold from other places, all right, that's a good plan. Well, this prince that comes down to marry Ankhesenamun, he's intercepted by the great general Horemheb, who comes up from the south. He's down with the Theban Theban priesthood. He never converted to the Aten. He was always down with Amun, the old god of the south. And as he comes up, he finds that Hittite prince, he kills him. We also don't see Ankhesenamun anymore in the record, so the assumption is she was done away with too. So before we ever hear the story of Cleopatra wooing Mark Antony or Julius Caesar to be a northern or European pharaoh and king of Egypt, we see this also from an earlier time, from an earlier queen, Ankhesenamun, who tried to align herself with Persia, with the Hittites and others, as against the African, upper Egyptian, Nubian, Ethiopian south. But it didn't work. Horemheb becomes basically the creator of what's now called the 19th dynasty. Right, so now that a military commander, instead of one of the children of the former queen mother, has to take the throne, he then starts the 19th dynasty. We'll have to do another video on Horemheb and Pianki, these New Kingdom kings that were very much into this idea of law enforcement, especially over this great state that still includes the south and the Syria up Punt, Kenya to the south, and Syria to the north. Again, they didn't lose the empire. Horemheb brings his military up, and as soon as he asserts himself and is recognized as the one and only pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, the taxes return from Punt, the taxes return from Syria, the taxes return from all these other places that enriches the state. And he is followed by a series of kings known as the Ramses. So now that you've heard of Ramses, and we're now into the biblical era, so again, note how much has gone on before we even are hearing about Hebrews or Greeks or Romans or what have you. Just awesome, awesome stuff. Again, the New Kingdom, the role of women is declining besides having queen mothers and outright pharaohs. They're not seen in public life. We don't see as many as doctors or whatnot. But we still do see matriarchy in effect, even if just quote-unquote as queens. Ramses II is prominently portrayed with Nefertari, right? Not Nefertiti, but Nefertari. So if you go to Abu Simbel, and again in the Sudan, in Nubia, one of the greatest structures of all time is our statues of Ramses II and Nefertari, who declared himself a god before the 10th year of his reign and outlived his 12 oldest sons. So again, this idea that maybe the presence and picture of the Queen Mother was needed, it was absolutely essential in the African South, may explain why such a prominent and awesome structure is created in Abu Simbel. Now, this idea of declaring himself a god, again, this is where this comes from. The idea that he is greater than the power of the priesthood and greater than the council of state, and therefore can issue law by edict. This is new, right? This is new. However, at the same time, it is autocratic. There is this idea of even penalties, notice of crimes, right, to subdue the nation and get it back to an orderly state. So when we talk about law enforcement, we'll talk about Horemheb and then Ramses, and then when we talk about the abolition of the death penalty as a means of promoting equal protection, we'll talk about Pianki. We can also talk about Ramses, one of the attempts on his life, and how he recused himself from the judgment so as to make sure that that a fair trial for the coup plotters was accepted by all, which is very interesting. So we'll talk later about law enforcement and ancient Kemet. But after Ramses II and his greatness, again, Upper Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, Punt, Syria, Palestine, all the way out to Libya, paying taxes to the state, it starts to fall apart. There's a series of Ramses, and then once we get to Ramses the 11th, Egypt is no longer able to protect itself, or at least Lower Egypt is not able to protect itself from incursions from Libyans, from these people that are coming from the north, outside of even the Semites, right? And we have secessions everywhere in the year 1085. Upper Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, Punt, they secede to the south, right? And pharaonic culture starts to move south. The north, Ramses 11, they put the capital of Egypt in Avris, near the delta. But things are falling apart. There's no tax revenue from the north in Syria. There's no tax revenue coming from the south. And there's no police, right? So here's the era of grave robbers. The state is falling so far apart that now even the practice of religion is not keeping the people away from the tombs of the Valley of the Kings and whatnot, and now grave robbers are taking everything. There's not enough money to pay the police. And note that the police in ancient Egypt were almost always Nubian. It's an interesting thing that we'll talk about when we talk about equal protection and law enforcement. And so the Queen Tuasret becomes the last pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, who basically rules Upper and Lower Egypt before they both go their separate ways. And after the 19th dynasty, again, the African part of the empire remains together. It stays intact, and it moves down to Napata, right, and becomes what the Kush, Meroe, Napata, and known by the ancient Greeks, who then start to filter into northern Egypt as just one whole mass known as the Ethiopians. Right, so that empire stays intact, yet is now a Nubian or Ethiopian empire, and it rises up as the 25th dynasty. Right, Pianki rises up as, again, a military guy that comes up with the 25th dynasty, tries to return Egypt to its former ways, all the way from Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. What do we mean? We mean Lower Egypt is now again paying taxes back to the Theban monarchy, back to Nubia, back to Napata. And he passes, but this only lasts for 50 years. Pianki's reign ends. Shabaka becomes the next pharaoh of that dynasty. After that, Taharka becomes the third king of that dynasty. And again, note, these guys were thought to be brothers, right? That they were born all of the same queen mother. That while this whole thing of patriarchy, again, is going on in Lower Egypt, that they once again return to their roots of patriarchy, where the queen mother, her children are eligible for the throne, and then the most able is then installed as the pharaoh or the king. And then that tradition is spread throughout Ethiopia or Nubia to the rest of Africa. And so in the Nile Valley, we again have this the Kandakis or the Candaces are well known as matriarchal heads of state in Nubia, in Ethiopia. And when we talk about Ethiopia, when we break Axum out from this amalgamation or of states between Punt and Nubia, and we come with Queen Makeda, also known as Queen Sheba. Again, another monarch, and hopefully this previous discussion shows you how important it was for the King Solomon to marry the Queen of Sheba. Because if he marries her as a queen mother of this African nation, then he becomes more or less the viceroy, or someone who is in control and has an authority to lay taxes. Because the idea of a queen mother of Egypt marrying someone outside, of Africa, marrying someone outside of Africa, is what leads towards the property succession leaking outwards, right? Because once this male person from outside becomes monarch and then uses wills, co-regencies, and contracts to pass the wealth and pass the monarchy and the authority on to sons directly, you're circumventing the council of the state. You're circumventing the queen mother. So we're talking about autocracy, a lack of equal protection, and also a lack of inconsistency with African cultural unity. So once we it doesn't stop outside of the Nile Valley. We're going to talk after the Nile Valley. We're going to talk about the Eastern Africa. We'll talk about Northern Africa. We'll talk about the Islamic conquest of Northern Africa, or the Arabic conquest of North Africa. But that doesn't mean, again, that the African presence is entirely subverted and put asunder. We'll talk very much about Queen Kahina, and how she was a famous Berber that gathered all the troops of the east and west, the Sanada and the Sanhaja Berbers, and led a resistance movement against Arab domination in northern Africa. And that not only does it show a persistence of and resistance of the Berber tribes and their sophistication and their willingness to form political unions, it also shows the persistence of African cultural unity as far as matriarchy, matrilineality, that we'll see even after Islam does go over North Africa down to West Africa. We'll still see plenty of abrogations of Islamic tenets with respect to womanhood. And then as we even go further south down the western coast of Africa, we'll go all the way down to Angola and talk about Queen Nzinga and see her story of how she, again, was a royal sister who then becomes outright queen and queen mother of a nation in West Africa, elected as such. It follows this Nubian Ethiopian model that was in existence over 2,000 years ago and over 2,000 miles away. If we take Angola and separate it, Angola of the 16th century, and compare it to Nubia or Ethiopia and Upper Egypt of 1000 and 1500 and 2000 BC. Now we see a similar, very similar political system with taxation, with matrilineality, with matriarchy, and she is creating also, with respect to equal protection of law, a free state, right? A state that is entirely in opposition to slavery, that if you touch its borders, that any slave or anyone running from slavery was free there, and that the state itself will be out to protect itself from the Portuguese on the one hand and from Islamic slave traders on another. So this great issue of African queendoms and equal protection of the law with respect to gender permeates the African history all the way from the Nile Valley, all the way through North Africa, West Africa, and then we'll talk later about Central and Southern Africa and Monomatapa, and where we finally see, again, as a reaction from slavery, this sort of hyper male takeover where women are to be protected and the land has to be protected by men because of these foreign invaders. And we see that the wealth and protection of the state seems to trump our consistency with Mott. So patrilineality, patriarchy, slavery, and these things seem to come much later, as you see a devolution of African cultural unity based on pressure from outsiders, basically on one hand the Arab and Islamic on the other, and also European and Christian from another side, all coming together to basically for gold, now oil, copper, bauxite, and all the resources of Africa. It's always been about the resources. So I hope you are awake and have enjoyed this 2-hour traipse through Egyptian history, basically the old, middle, and new kingdom, to talk about matrilineality and matriarchy. We're going to continue our discussions in another episode in another couple of days, but I'm going to let you go. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, Afrolantica.com. Go to Amazon Kindle, buy the book Taxes, Death, and Trouble, and always remember, better educate ourselves and our children. Let's start and patronize black businesses. Let's stop unduly criticizing each other. Let's accumulate human, social, political, and financial capital. Hotep.